for joining us tonight. We're excited for the privilege to host tonight's speaker, Mr. G. Vance Smith. Mr. Smith is the president of the Freedom First Society, and he has been involved for several decades in what we term the freedom fight. Following the presentation, Mr. Smith will be available to answer questions one-on-one. Please join me in welcoming Mr. G. Vance Smith.
Again, it's good to be with you. Thank you so much for being here. The topic tonight, as you can see from the screen, is a book was published just earlier this year entitled Masters of Deception. You're here this evening because you, like so many Americans, are concerned about what's going on. Our nation's in trouble, isn't it? We're losing our freedoms. We're losing our freedoms very gradually. And that's the concern that we all have. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of voices out there expressing concern. And many of us have been involved over the years in various ways to try and improve our situation. But it doesn't seem to improve that much, does it? And that's why we're here. And the book that we wrote, Masters of Deception, is about the Council on Foreign Relations, the rise of the Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. How many of you have heard of the Council on Foreign Relations? A good number of you. Okay, good. Well, that gives us a common place to start this evening. The topic in this book is not new. In fact, the first book I read about the CFR was a book written in the early 60s by a fellow named Dan Smoot. Dan Smoot was a retired FBI agent. He wrote a book entitled The Invisible Government. What he was suggesting in his book is while we as the American people concern ourselves, as we should, with the elective process and the various administrations, in reality, there's a government behind the scenes. There's some people back there pulling some levers. And so he wrote that book, I think in 1962, if I'm not mistaken. A few years later, another book was written. Only this book was written by one of those that had been involved in the Council on Foreign Relations, a fellow named Dr. Carroll Quigley. He was a professor at Georgetown University. He wrote a book, a 1,300-page tome entitled Tragedy and Hope. His point was not to condemn what had been going on, but to praise those who had moved to change our system, working behind the scenes. And he identified the Council on Foreign Relations, where it came from, and so forth. Well, it was such an expose that there were a couple of individuals that wrote books reviewing his book. And so shortly after, a fellow named Cleon Skousen. Now, some of you have heard of Skousen. Skousen wrote a book in the 50s called The Naked Communist. And so as he reviewed Carroll Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, he titled it The Naked Capitalist. And he addressed the issue of the influence of the CFR, the influence of the Council on Foreign Relations. A year or two after that, 1971, I believe, 72, a fellow named Gary Allen wrote a book called None Dare Call It Conspiracy. And that book sold about 6 million copies in those early 70s. So you see, the subject of the CFR has been around. Some people have heard of it. The last book written on it was written about 25 years ago. So in our organization, myself and Tom Gow, my associate, decided it was really important to write this book and to update it. But I want to make sure that you understand that we were standing on the shoulders of some pretty great thinkers who had done a lot of research. But we wanted to bring it forward. We wanted to bring it to today, to current administrations, and also to illustrate that the CFR has an influence far greater than just presidential administrations. And so that's why we wrote this book. I'm going to be talking to you for the next hour, and we're going to be talking about some of the high points that's in this book and of the issues that we're facing, the trouble that we're in, and the solution. But if you're going to really understand it, you need to read. There's literature on the table over there, including this book, so that you can get the big picture and the documentation and the sources. Now, as we get started, I want to talk about where we all are. If we go down a path, we start at the wrong place and go down a road, we might get to the wrong destination. So we've got to decide what the assumption or what the premise is that we're going to work on. Now, there's a lot of voices out there that are kind of guiding the thinking of people. So we're going to talk about assumptions for a moment. Here's an assumption. We're hearing this from lots of conservative voices. The assumption is the National Democratic Party and National Republican Party have major philosophical differences. So we will solve our problems by electing a Republican president. That's what a lot of people are saying. There's an assumption. I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but my dad used to say it like this. If you pick up one end of the stick, you're going to get the other end. Okay? So if we start on that premise, then has it worked in the past? We have to ask ourselves this question. One of the reasons why you're here, and one of the reasons why so many Americans are concerned around our country, is because of Barack Obama. He has helped to wake a lot of people, hasn't he? But if we look at the deterioration of our freedoms and liberties, did it start with the Barack Obama administration? Didn't, did it? So anyway, that's just an assumption. Here's another assumption. Conspiracy is a foolish notion and theory. It isn't possible for all that threatens America and the world to be calculated and organized. Again, a lot of the voices we're hearing out there are saying, this is just an evolutionary process. This is just what's happening to our country. But there's no master plan behind it. There's no one calculating and taking us to the destination. In fact, a lot of them will become very emphatic that there's no conspiracy. Well, the question is, are these assumptions true or false? Since I put the presentation together, the answer is they're false. But we're going to spend a little time now talking about why I believe they're false. And why, again, if we study, we'll find out that they are false. In fact, there's an interesting statement that Franklin Delano Roosevelt made many years ago. To paraphrase him, he said, "There's nothing in politics that happens by accident." That's quite an interesting statement, isn't it? Okay. On the cover of our book, again, was this statement by the famous patriot Edmund Burke. He said, "The people never give up their liberties, but under some delusion." Think about that for a moment. We've lost some of our liberties, haven't we? Has it been because trucks loaded with soldiers with swastika armbands and rifles have jumped out of the trucks and come and taken our liberties from us? That hasn't been the case. We've given them up. We've simply given them up. And what Burke said is that will happen under some delusion. So we're going to talk about that tonight. Now, as we get started again, I want to ask a question. In your study of world history, have there been any individuals that wanted to rule the world? Have there been any people that you can think of in history that were bound and determined to control the entire planet?
Napoleon, for one.
Napoleon. Name some others. Alexander the Great. Who else?
Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan. I heard Obama, but then anyway. What? Stalin? Lenin?
No.
Mao Zedong? Okay, but there were some people in history before now, interestingly, that had a plan to rule the world. Well, let me start with one here. If we go back and if we'll use the Bible as a text, perhaps the first one that I would talk to us about tonight would be a guy named Nimrod. Does that name mean anything? Nimrod was known as the hunter, but he was hunting people, and he wanted to control, and he wanted to control everyone. He built a tower, right? What was that called? The Tower of Babel. And this is a painting of the Tower of Babel. This was done in the 16th century. The 16th century was still a long time after the Tower of Babel incident, so this is the way this artist thought the Tower of Babel must have looked, right? Well, apparently, and as we read in the scriptures, God didn't like the idea, so the Tower of Babel was destroyed, right? The people were scattered. They weren't going to be all controlled. They were scattered, and the languages were confounded, right? Okay, so that might be a good example. But if we go back to this subject of individuals that wanted to control the world, another one was mentioned, Alexander the Great. Took a pretty good shot at it, didn't he? He almost did control the world. And another one someone mentioned was Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon seized power after the French Revolution, and we know the story of having control, calling himself an emperor, all that he did, and until he met his Waterloo, he was on the way to ruling the world. Someone mentioned Hitler. And then Mussolini. Now there's others, you mentioned some others. But there's an interesting thing, if you will, when it comes to Hitler and to Stalin and Lenin and Mussolini. They wanted to rule the world. In fact, Mussolini, he purportedly said, God and I will rule the world. At least he was willing to share, apparently. But there's an interesting thing about Stalin and Lenin and Mussolini and Hitler. They were going to do it by establishing what? They were all going to do it by establishing socialism. What does Nazi mean? What's the Nazi party mean? The National Socialist Party. What does USSR mean? Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. What is fascism? Just another branch, another way of government control, of complete government control. Another form of socialism. And so these fellows, individually and collectively, in their efforts to move towards ruling the world, referred back to the Communist Manifesto. Back into the 1840s, when Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were tasked to write the Communist Manifesto, a booklet that describes how nations of the world would become socialist nations. It's all about socialism. And as those nations became socialist, they would then move towards a global socialist society. So that's an interesting thing. But for us, there's the question, isn't it neat that nobody since Hitler and Mussolini put up any effort to rule the world? That whole power lust is gone, right? Doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense that throughout history there were those with that power lust. So what we're going to talk about is those in today's world. Now, going back a number of years and talking about socialism, in England, started the Fabian Socialist Society. Have you heard of that? Okay, here's the symbol or coat of arms of the Fabian Socialist Society. The picture tells the whole story. It doesn't have to have a lot written. What does the picture tell us? They have a plan to bring about socialism in England and throughout the world, and they're going to do it with what kind of a tactic? Deceit. They are the wolves, the ravaging wolf, but they have that sheep's clothing upon them. So that the people, as they are moved towards socialism, they don't get it. They have a plan, it's called a conspiracy, by the way, to bring about something without the people knowing it. Well, one of the founders of the Fabian Socialist Society was George Bernard Shaw. You know that name? Of course, when we were in school, we studied Pygmalion. Remember the play that George Bernard Shaw wrote? It was made into a movie called My Fair Lady. He was a writer, he was a philosopher, and he was a critic that would write in the newspapers in Great Britain. He said, "I am a communist, but not a member of the Communist Party. Stalin is a first-rate Fabian. I am one of the founders of Fabianism, and as such, very friendly to Russia." Well, he certainly was very friendly to Russia and supported what happened in taking down the czars and the establishment of communism with Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. Now, there's a window here, a stained glass window, and you can see at the right, in the green, is George Bernard Shaw. And as he and another are, with their hammers, are pounding out this global socialism, behind them, between them, you'll see the coat of arms that we showed a moment ago with the wolf in sheep's clothing. Down at the bottom of this council of supporters, clear over on the far left, is an image of H.G. Wells. Do you remember that name? H.G. Wells, again, was an author and writer of great note. He wrote a book in 1940 entitled The New World Order. In it, Wells said, "It is the system of national individualism that has to go. We are living in the end of the sovereign states. As we move towards socialism and global socialism, then the states, various nations will have to give up their nationhood." And he's saying clearly that national individualism has to go. Why would that be important? Because that's the mark of a free person, isn't it? A free man, a free woman is an individualist. And by the way, they know that it's very hard to herd individualists. Herding individualists is like herding cats. They don't herd. So one of the ways we're going to reduce them from individualists is through a very careful, another name, a Gramscian plan of reducing the level of morality. Because if the level of morality falls in a nation, and we know that every nation, kingdom, and empire in the history of the world that fell because of moral decline. But if you can reduce the moral fiber of the nation, of the people, now you're dealing with animals. Now they can be herded. So it's an interesting choice of words where he said, it is the system of national individualism that has to go. And so, in a very real way, you people, and people like you throughout this country, are the last of those rugged individualists who really want to be free. Now, there was another individual that wanted to rule the world whose names we don't hear very often, because the others all got a lot of attention in the media and in the history books. But this fellow, Adam Weishaupt, His name was not touted very much. Have you heard of him? All those of you that heard of Adam Weishaupt, raise your hand. Okay. Weishaupt formed what we call the Illuminati on May 1st of 1776. The Illuminati was formed. That's kind of a fun thing. As Mary introduced me, she said, I've been doing this for a long time. I guess I got involved first in the freedom fight in the early 60s, 1964, I think, where I was involved in an organized effort. If I spoke to the subject of the Illuminati and Adam Weishaupt in the 70s, for instance, a lot of eyes would roll. But today, with the advent of the computer, now everybody can just Google it. Just go home and Google Weishaupt, Google Illuminati, and you're going to see documented right there the very things that we've been talking about for years. And yet, it has not made the radar screen of most people. Well, anyway, the symbol of the Illuminati is here. It's on the back of the seal of the United States. Isn't that interesting? On your dollar bill, those of you that are still fortunate enough to have one, on the dollar bill, there's the front and the back of the seal of the United States, right? The front of the seal we see all the time, behind the President of the United States or in front of him as he speaks. But the back is also on the dollar bill, and it's this. Under the pyramid, in Latin, is Novus Ordo Seclorum. That means New World Order. New Order of the Ages, New World Order. At the bottom of the pyramid are the Roman numerals 1776. Well, for most people, that's okay because that's a great year for us, wasn't it? That's the 4th of July, independence. But it was also on May 1st of 1776 that Weishaupt formed the Illuminati. Okay? What's the most significant holiday in the communist world? May Day. Because on May 1st of 1776, the Illuminati was founded and was formed. That's an interesting thing about the organizational structure, as you can see in that pyramid. The lines go all the way across. So if a person is inducted into the Illuminati, there's a line, and as far as they're concerned, they might be the only people there, except there's somebody above them that's bringing them along. But as they advance up that pyramid structure, it gets narrower and narrower, doesn't it? So there's fewer and fewer people that have paid their dues, whatever those dues and requests are, and requirements are that get them there. And then if they get to the top, there's that little sea of tranquility. Then you've got the top of the pyramid with the all-seeing eye. And what is it? It's illuminated. That's the symbol of the Illuminati. Well, Weishaupt formed the Illuminati, and he said this: "The great strength of our order lies in its concealment. Let it never appear in any place in its own name, but always covered by another name or another occupation." So then how do we know? How do we know there was an Illuminati? Well, back in those days, in the late 18th century, a courier carrying secret documents was providentially, I suppose, struck by lightning. The secret documents in his pouch were found, and it exposed the efforts of the Illuminati. Now, the governments of Europe were aware that something was going on. We don't have a lot of time to go into the intrigue, but this gave them the proof that they needed. Because those documents came forward and exposed the Illuminati, there was a fellow in Britain in 1798 wrote a book called Proofs of a Conspiracy named John Robison. And in his book, he explained what the Illuminati had been doing. A Frenchman, about the same time, Abbé Barel, also wrote a book. So there were at least two books documenting the Illuminati in those early years. Now, why is it important? Because of the slogan they had. The slogan was Novus Ordo Seclorum, meaning New World Order. What was H.G. Wells' book that he wrote in 1940 called? The New World Order. Okay. Nesta Webster wrote a number of books about the Illuminati. She said, from Weishaupt through Babeuf, Marx, and Lenin, the revolutionaries pushed the 5 abolitions, namely of monarchy and all other ordered government, of national patriotism, of property and inheritance, of all religion, and of marriage and the family. So her research about the Illuminati said that there were 5 major things that they were working to abolish. Ordered governments, national patriotism, property and inheritance rights. They would abolish all religion and marriage and family. Now, are any of those under attack today? Interesting, isn't it? Others were very much aware of the Illuminati. George Washington stated, "It was not my intention to doubt that the doctrines of the Illuminati and the principles of Jacobinism had not spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more truly satisfied of this fact than I am." He was very aware of the Illuminati. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, both at different times, but while they were both in Paris, both, as we know, ministers in Paris for our government, they were approached by the Illuminati. The Illuminati was real. But there's all this evidence that it was a secret society, it was a conspiracy to rule the world. And its principle was to bring about a new world order, to consolidate the power, to bring about a one world government. Well, what happens when the Illuminati is exposed? Does it just go away? Do they say, hey, we play fair, now you found out what we're going to do, we're just going to go home and stop? No, what happens when a conspiracy like that is exposed? They just simply go underground, don't they? And so a few years later, you have it popping up with a fellow named John Ruskin. Ruskin was a professor at Oxford University. He was an art critic, an art collector. We could spend some time on Ruskin, but we don't have that time. So let me just simply say that he was a key in moving the philosophies and teachings of the Illuminati forward. And he said, "Indeed, I am myself a communist of the old school, reddest also of the red." Well, he had some followers and some disciples, and one was a guy named Cecil Rhodes. Now, you've heard that name, haven't you? Cecil Rhodes. What does the name Rhodes mean? How significant is it? Rhodes Scholars. How about Rhodesia? Cecil Rhodes was referred to as the richest man in the world and an ardent disciple of socialist John Ruskin. As the leader of the Secret Society of the Elect, Rhodes organized the influential Round Table Network, which ultimately spawned, where are we going with this whole presentation? The Council on Foreign Relations. Can you see what happens here? We can document from the Illuminati, through Ruskin and Cecil Rhodes and others, a trail that leads down to Cecil Rhodes' roundtable groups and the formation of, as they were the same people, connected with the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations is alive and well. In fact, we hear about it a great deal today. 20, 30 years ago, they were very, very secret, very secretive. Today, not so much. However, they paint themselves in a very different position and a very different image than they really are. The headquarters of the Council on Foreign Relations is in New York City, on Manhattan, on actually Park Avenue. This is the Pratt House, the headquarters of the CFR. Let's talk about how it came about just in a few moments. The beginning of the last century, there was a war, right? It was called the Great War. It was later called the First World War. There were individuals that were trying to move this conspiratorial idea of the Illuminati forward. And so, feeling like the American people were so upset, as well as people of other parts of the world, that they would allow a world organization to be placed before them. So along with the Treaty of Versailles that we've all heard of after the First World War, there was a world body proposed to be started. What was it called? The League of Nations. And it was the idea of these insiders to create this League of Nations because they wanted to make sure that there would be no more wars. And if you get all the nations of the world talking to each other, that will mean there'll be no more wars, right? Boy, that's a shallow thought, wasn't it? But they pushed that idea forward. It went to the Senate of the United States, and a very few men in the Senate rejected the League of Nations. It didn't happen. They stood up and said, our fathers, our forefathers, founded this great nation that would be separate and sovereign and free of the entanglements of Europe. Oh, we don't want a League of Nations, and it was rejected. Of those people who pushed that League of Nations, just a few years later, determined to start the Council on Foreign Relations. So in 1921, in the summer of 1921, the Council on Foreign Relations was formed. And what was the mission of the Council on Foreign Relations? To bring about a new world order. Well, you start that by creating a global government, if you will, or a global society, or a world organization. We didn't get the League of Nations. We did get the Council on Foreign Relations in 1921, and then in 1945, that's 24 years later, with some of those people still alive and very much involved, they did get past a world organization, and what was it called? The United Nations. Many of the same people. In 1945, there were still some alive who had engineered the League of Nations. The Council on Foreign Relations was growing to accomplish its purpose, and in 1945, we got the United Nations. Okay. Senator Barry Goldwater, I put this quote in here because this is a presidential election year, and show you how old I was. This was the first opportunity I got to vote, was in 1964 when Barry Goldwater was running for president. Remember ancient history? Okay, Barry Goldwater said, the Council on Foreign Relations is the American branch of a society which originated in England. It believes national boundaries should be obliterated and one world rule established. Okay? Almost simultaneously with the creation of the Council on Foreign Relations in America, the Fabian Socialists and others moving forward organized their own Council on Foreign Relations in England, and that was called the Royal Institute of International Affairs. And that's why Barry Goldwater says that it originated in England. They had the same situation, wanting to move that agenda forward. Now here's one of theirs, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the name Nelson Rockefeller. You know that name. He was a governor of New York, right? He was also vice president of the United States for a very short time. He was not elected, but he was appointed to be Vice President of the United States. Nelson Rockefeller said, "The nation state is becoming less and less competent to perform its international political tasks. These are some of the reasons pressing us to lead vigorously toward the true building of a new world order." We're right back to that slogan, aren't we? A good guy, John Rarick, who was a member of the House of Representatives from Louisiana, said this: "The Council on Foreign Relations uses individuals and groups to justify the high-level decisions for converting the United States from a sovereign constitutional republic to a servile member state of a one-world dictatorship." You see, there have been voices warning us about this Council on Foreign Relations. In our book, we devote a chapter of the book to the environmental movement. Now, there's a wonderful lady, she's passed away, but she's a wonderful lady who did so much research on this whole thing, Dr. Dixie Lee Ray. She wrote The Environmental Overkill, and these are her words. "First, we must recognize that the environmental movement is not about facts or logic." Does anybody want to argue that? "More and more, it is becoming clear that those who support the so-called New World Order or world government under the United Nations have adopted global environmentalism as a basis for the dissolution of independent nations and the international realignment of power." Now that's Dr. Dixie Lee Ray's take as she looks at the environment. If there was a power grab to create a global government, the environment would be a perfect thing to attach yourself to, wouldn't it? Because the environment is out there over everything. It's over all of the nations. There's no borders. And so you can use the environment, or what we're faced with again right now is the Law of the Sea treaties. So all the liberals are trying to get the Law of the Sea treaty passed. What will it do? The Law of the Sea treaty will empower the United Nations so that it will have control of the seas. Again, inching towards global control. Another name that I'm sure you're familiar with and remember is Henry Kissinger. In a 1993 column that appeared in the July 18th Los Angeles Times, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger declared, NAFTA will represent the most creative step towards a new world order taken by any group of countries since the end of the Cold War, and the first step toward an even larger vision of a free trade zone for the entire Western Hemisphere. So here's Henry Kissinger, a long-time member of the Council on Foreign Relations, had served as our Secretary of State, right? And he's saying, NAFTA, this is a neat thing, even though it's just 3 countries in our hemisphere, Canada, United States, and Mexico. NAFTA is what? The North American Free Trade Agreement, right? And it's a huge step, he said, towards a new world order. But then he gets all really excited about it's going to lead to a bigger regional government for the whole hemisphere. That makes sense, wouldn't it? If you're going to go from nationhood to a one world government, maybe logically there's another step, and that's regional government. Now, when I was a young man, and I'm not even sure when it was, but I was required to read 1984 by George Orwell. Did anybody else read 1984? Oh, my goodness. For the rest of you, it's a book you should read, but don't expect a happy ending. Okay? But he wrote this book. He became apparently somewhat disenchanted. So he wrote a book about socialism out of control. in 1984, and he described, okay, he wrote the book in 1948. He reversed the last two numbers and said 1984. Like 84 is a long way away from 1948. And so the assumption in his book 1984 is nations had already given up their nationhood. They had already become parts of regional governments. So you had three regions, according to Orwell. You had Eurasia, Europe, you had East Asia, and you had Oceania. Is that right? And then the books built on that premise of they were warring against each other and so forth. But nevertheless, the nations had already given up nationhood. So it would make sense in the plan to bring about world government to go to regional governments. Now, has that happened? Well, we got NAFTA. But after we got NAFTA, there was a real move towards a hemispheric government here. And what's it called? It was called the Free Trade Area of the Americas. And it was pushed by both Republican and Democrat administrations. Okay? Is regional government a concern in any other part of the world? What's happened in Europe? Again, you see, it goes past our radar purview. Back in the 50s, in Europe, they decided that they wanted to improve trade with mining and steel and so forth. And so this very innocuous idea was presented that in order to improve trade in Europe, we're going to come up with something they call the common market. Remember that? The common market. And it's always about trade. We're going to improve trade. Well, the common market was there, just kind of sitting there for a few decades. And then they said, even though they were doing a lot behind the scenes, they said, we're going to create a little higher profile. They changed the name, and it went from common market to what? The European Union, right? We're going to improve trade in Europe. We got a problem in order to improve trade. We got all these currencies with these different countries. You got the pound and the franc and the mark and the shilling and the lira, and it's messing things up. So they got a consensus and they removed all those currencies and replaced it with the euro. Now they said, okay, now we've got this European Union, we've got this euro, we need a little more muscle to be able to administer all of this. And so they said, we need a court. So now they've got the European Union courts. We need a constitution. They come up with a European Union constitution. And then they said, well, we need a parliament. You see the progress? See the camel's nose in the tent, where all of that goes? Now, I'm supposing that many of the leaders of the nations over there knew what was going on, but some didn't. And one day they woke up and said, guess what? We're not running our countries anymore. What's happened? I was president of this country. I was the potentate of this country. Now all the decisions are being made by the European Union. What happened? Well, they decided they had to have a parliament. So they went around Europe putting up posters and campaigning for a parliament. And this was the poster that was placed all over Europe. Does that picture look familiar? Here's the slogan, Europe, many tongues, one voice. In other words, God might have scattered us.
But we're going to do it anyway.
But our slogan is many tongues, one voice. And they start working with this poster to bring about a parliament and a parliament building. Anything else interesting about that poster? If you look at the stars, what are they? Those are pentagrams. Those are satanic symbols. Okay? Well, guess what? They got their Parliament building. How's it look?
Like a modernization of the Tower of Babel.
Isn't this an interesting coincidence? You see, as they move forward, this symbolism means a great deal to them. And so the Parliament building built in Strasbourg is similar to that artist's painting of the Tower of Babel. Now, let's come a little bit closer to home with the Council on Foreign Relations. With the Council on Foreign Relations, here's a Vice President of the United States speaking at the Washington, D.C. office of the CFR. And again, as you'll notice, he's not a Democrat. Doesn't fall in that category.
And we're leaving this taped segment to bring you live coverage of Vice President Dick Cheney speaking at the Council on Foreign Relations on economics and foreign policy.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, Les, Pete, I want to thank you all for the warm welcome today. I see a lot of old friends in the room, and it's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming, but stood me in good stead. I valued very much my experience and exposure to the tremendous people involved and the involvement in the ideas and the debates and the great policy issues of the day.
Thank you so much, Mr. Vice President. Let me invite one of our oldest and dearest members to begin the questioning, David Rockefeller. And I would say, as David stands to ask his question, that David also played a key role in the formation of this geoeconomic center with ideas and with his generosity as well. David?
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, I just enjoyed so much your whole speech, but I was particularly pleased that you gave such a strong endorsement for the free trade agreement for all the Americans, subject that has been of great concern to me for many years, and particularly recently, and I think it's absolutely essential for the strength of our economy.
Okay, so you have Dick Cheney, who came from a conservative state in Wyoming, and he's saying, I've been a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, I've been a member of the Board of Directors, and it's put me in good stead. Well, it certainly did, my goodness. If you look at going from a congressman in Wyoming to being a chief of staff in one administration, a secretary of defense in another administration, vice president in another, and a board member of Halliburton and all of that, yes, it did put him in good stead, didn't it? But essentially, he said in-house, he deceived the people in Wyoming. They're masters of deception. Significantly, David Rockefeller, who we just heard, applauded what Vice President Cheney had said relative to the free trade area of the Americas. Now, David Rockefeller had served as the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations. In the early 1970s, David Rockefeller created another parallel group to the Council on Foreign Relations called the Trilateral Commission. You've heard of that. The Trilateral Commission is a group of only 100 people from each of 3 world regions: Asia, Europe, Oceania, if you will. And so David Rockefeller says he was real happy with the discussion relative to the free trade area of the Americas, as it would move toward a regional government in our part of the world, okay? David Rockefeller in June turned 97. I keep watching, I keep Googling David Rockefeller to see how long he's going to live, but he's 97. He wrote a book 10 years ago, his memoirs, and he said this: "Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that's the charge, I stand guilty and am proud of it." So here's one of the most powerful men in the world, and certainly in our country. The wealth and control of the Rockefellers it just is huge compared with all of the other wealthy people that are put before us. And he said, "I've been accused of working against the best interests of my country, of conspiring with others around the world to bring about internationalism, one world, if you will, and I'm guilty and I'm proud of it." Okay?
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
So here's President Bush, the first, promoting the idea of a novus ordo seclorum, a new world order. And he says, as we move forward, and we will, that it's going to bring about a world government as envisioned by the founders of the United Nations. And then he uses the idea of the peacekeeping forces of the United Nations to make sure that happens. Okay? They're masters of deception. I personally do not listen to much talk radio. I don't have the opportunity with my schedule and so forth, but I was in a car with someone just maybe 6 months ago, and we were driving he picked me up and was taking me to a presentation, and we were listening in the afternoon to a national radio conservative personality. And what we heard from this radio host was, we have to get rid of Obama no matter what it takes. And what we really need now is a George Bush. That's what was being promoted. Is that what we need? But they're deceiving people. And they're calling this person a conservative and this person a liberal, and avoiding the real issues that we're talking about here this evening. Let's look at the Council on Foreign Relations and some of the administrations. Go back to we can go back to many more, but let's just do a few. Here's 2 or 3 Democrat administrations. Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976. He was only in 4 years, from 77 to 81. Back in those years, there were only about 1,600 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. 340 of them were in his administration, in the Carter administration. I want to emphasize that. We call it the Carter administration. I'm not indicting the president. I'm saying it's the Carter administration. There were 340. Carter himself was not a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. However, just a year or two earlier, he was one of the founders with David Rockefeller, one of the initial members of the Trilateral Commission. Then along comes Billy Clinton. He had 548 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. He himself is a member of the CFR. Then you come to Barack Obama. He had 448 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. I intentionally put the Secretary of Defense up there first. Remember, the first Secretary of Defense in the Obama administration was Robert Gates. What was Obama's slogan? If you elect Obama, you're going to get what? Change. Well, who put Robert Gates in as Secretary of Defense? George W. Bush. There was no change. You remember the CFR? He was orchestrating the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they just left him in. Didn't get any change there. Reagan administration, 318 members of the Council on Foreign Relations, including his vice president, who we just heard from, George Bush Sr. George Bush Jr., 525 members of the Council on Foreign Relations in his administration, including his vice president, who we just listened to. Now, a way that we can really judge what's going on is by looking at our national debt. If government increases the debt, it's to purchase what? More government bureaus, more government bureaucrats. The whole idea of increasing that pot, more control in government. Well, we can go back and look at the chart. I've chosen to start here with the Eisenhower administration. I'm sure there was some debt before that, but if you go back much further, our government was just like good citizens. If they got in debt, they paid it back. But starting here with the Eisenhower administration, if you go over to the far right, you see the first benchmark is $1.5 trillion. And you can see where Eisenhower administration was for its 8 years. Then comes along Kennedy and Johnson, 8 years, a little stair step up. Then comes Nixon and Ford, 8 years, a little stair step up. Then comes in Carter, he was in 4 years. Then we got to the Republican administration of Ronald Reagan. And it was a big step up, wasn't it? Huge increase in the national debt, huge increase in government. Then he was followed by his vice president. George Sr. only served 4 years, and look at that huge jump in just 4 years. He was followed by Bill Clinton, who was in 8 years. As you can see, the Clinton administration did not raise the national debt as much as George Sr. did in 4. Why? Well, the reason why is the way we're conditioned. If it's a Democrat administration, in those days, we watched them much more closely. Besides that, Bill Clinton was kind of preoccupied with Monica Lewinsky and a few other things. But the growth of government wasn't as great. And then he was followed by the George Bush Jr. administration, and then look what happened. It went up to $10 trillion in the 8 years of that Bush administration. Then we come along to Obama, and now Obama, as we can see, has moved it very close to $16 trillion. Where does it go? Where does it go from here? I mean, just logic. It won't work. It can't continue unless we understand once again that one of the objectives is an objective stated by Stalin and others to destroy a free nation is to debauch its currency. And Keynesian economics is a part of that plan. So we come back to the assumption. And the assumption is by putting another Republican administration in, is that going to make a difference? Well, it will. It'll make some difference. But it won't make the difference that we want, because that's something that we've seen going on for a long period of time. What will make a difference is to create an informed electorate. That is the difference. And that's the reason why we formed Freedom First Society. Our organization was formed in October of 2007. Here in 2 months, we'll be 5 years old. We've grown a great deal in the almost 5 years of our existence, and one reason is because of the Obama administration, because people really are concerned about what's going on. But those people that are concerned, just like you here, want to make real change. They want to know what they can do to really fix the problem. The mission of the Freedom First Society is twofold. One, to return us to a constitutional republic, to go back to our Constitution, to restore the Constitution, to put it in place as the Founding Fathers envisioned the Constitution. That's one part of the mission. The second part of the mission is to expose those organized forces that are working to destroy the Constitution. It isn't happening by accident. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations is not the only problem, but it's certainly a major problem here in our country, as they have their own agenda to bring about regional and world socialism. And they will use whatever party or whatever platform or whatever organization they can to create more government and more control. So our mission, once again, is to preserve the Constitution. In the first place, we have to get people to read the Constitution. We need them to understand it. It's a short document. If you take it home or give it to your children or grandchildren or neighbors, it's something they can read in an hour and 10 or hour and 20 minutes. There's a lot of talk, particularly in election years, about Constitution. It's not taught in the schools. So we have to go back and we have to say, what is it about this Constitution that was so great? That with the principles of the Constitution, our nation became the greatest nation in the world. And if we understand the principles, if we understand what it says, then we can work to go back to it. I love this cartoon. It says, this is the USS Constitution going over the cliff. It says, it's time we read the owner's manual. It's time we read the owner's manual. The Constitution is still alive and well. 535 members of Congress, 435 in the House, 100 in the Senate, go to Washington. They're all required to put their hand on a Bible and raise their right hand, right? And swear an oath. They swear to God to uphold the Constitution. Do they do it? They don't do it. Whose fault is it? Yeah, it's certainly theirs because they're deceiving us. But it's ours because this is a government of the people, by the people and for the people. It's our government. We don't just elect people and then turn our backs on them and let them do whatever they darn well want under the direction and money flowing to them through organizations like we talked about tonight. Our job is what Jefferson said was eternal vigilance, to see that they uphold the Constitution. You've heard the story. Thomas Jefferson was chided by someone because he wasn't supporting a particular elected official to Congress. And to paraphrase Thomas Jefferson, I love this quote. This is why I don't get too nervous with partisan politics. Thomas Jefferson said, confidence in politicians is everywhere the parent of despotism. Bind them down from mischief with the chains of the Constitution. In other words, don't tell me about confidence in man. If he's upholding the Constitution, I will support him or her. If not, I won't. That has to be the barometer for us, the Constitution of the United States. They still swear an oath to it. We need to understand it. We need to insist that they uphold it. Does that make sense? The second aspect of our mission is to expose those forces working to destroy us, like the Council on Foreign Relations. Henry David Thoreau said, "There is 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." If you look at that tree, there's all kinds of branches on the tree, and we can busy ourselves all of our lives and do wonderful things relative to the problems that we have, whether it's the attack on the family relative to drugs or abortion or whatever, whether there's gun control issues, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency or what. There's all of these branches we can cut at, but like Thoreau, if we cut at the trunk, if we cut at the root and fell the whole tree, we get them all. And that's what we're talking about in exposing the CFR and, if you will, the conspiracy. It's a plan, it's an agenda. And they've been working it very successfully over a number of years. Biggest problem we have is we don't see the seriousness of the battle. It's like that frog that we hear about, that proverbial frog in the boiling water. Since we don't see it at our front door, we feel like some degree of safety. But look around the world. Look what socialism has done to other nations in the world. There is no middle class or upper middle class in those nations. There's two classes. There's the slaves and those that control them. There's the socialist elite and there's the rest of the people. We don't need to get to where we've lost our freedoms before we're willing to stand up and preserve them, because they'll be darn hard to get back. Right now, we're still free. Right now, you can have tea parties. You can have other organizations that will stand up and speak out. Over the last nearly 5 years, we've had the privilege of speaking to a lot of the Tea Party organizations, for example. Tea Party is a movement. And what's happened over the last 2 or 3 years is kind of whoever gets the microphone directs the movement of that organization, of that group. Well, as they've found out about us, we have an organized plan. We have a plan, as we started our organization 5 years ago, a book called Organized for Victory. A plan in place that if we'll work hard and diligently, we can restore our freedoms. Here's part of the plan. One person, well informed, if you will, one member of Freedom First Society will influence 10 other people. That's just what happens. When somebody becomes aware of what's going on, they just naturally want to tell their friends and their neighbors and their relatives. Those 10 will inform 10 each. So one person will influence 10 people directly and 100 people indirectly. Therefore, if you could get 1,000 people, 1,000 patriots, 1,000 members of Freedom First Society, or 1,000 people who are not fooled by partisan politics and who, like Jefferson, will vote for people who will uphold the Constitution, that 1,000 will influence 100,000. Now, does 1,000 sound like a lot? It does until you think about a congressional district. I was going to do the math today. How many people, how many citizens are in the United States? I should say 300 million. So if you take 300 million and you divide it into 435 congressional districts, what do you got? You got somewhere around 725, 750,000 people live in a congressional district. If there's 700,000, now does 1,000 sound like a lot? It's a believable number. In Idaho, for instance, in eastern Idaho right now, Greg, we have 8 chapters. We're about to start 2 more. We're about halfway in that congressional district in eastern Idaho. There's only 2 members of the House of Representatives. We're about halfway there. And we're starting to see, because of an informed electorate, we're starting to see changes already. But once we reach that 800 to 1,000 people who are informed, they're going to have an environment where constitutionalist Republicans are run against constitutionalist Democrats, against constitutionalist independents, and you're going to have constitutionalists, not only in the House of Representatives, but in the Senate, in the school board, in the county commission, and the city council. You're going to have constitutionalists because the people are informed. Again, we're in an election year. I'm getting old. I can't tell you how many broken hearts I've had in my life of people I have worked for and thought absolutely sure that when they were elected, they will uphold the Constitution. Did they do it? No. In 2008, Barack Obama was elected. In 2010, with a lot of good influence by Tea Party and other people, the House of Representatives was taken back by the Republicans, right? Then, right after that happened, one of the first things they had to deal with was reinstituting the Patriot Act. If you look at the Patriot Act and combine it with Homeland Security, there is nothing more unconstitutional that I can think of. It's the creation of a national police force, not under the control of the Congress, under the control of the President. So you have Hitler with his Gestapo or SA, you have the Soviet leaders with their KGB. Our founding fathers would do flip-flops in their graves over our having a national police force. Was it voted down by that new Congress? No, it wasn't. Why was it not? Because the Patriot Act had been put in by a Republican administration, right? And therefore, instead of voting the Constitution, they were so sincere about the Constitution, they even had it read in Congress. But when it came to voting the Constitution, they voted Republican instead of the Constitution. That has to change. And the only way it's going to change is to create this informed electorate who will say, now that you're in, we expect you to uphold the Constitution. We expect, if you swear to God to uphold the Constitution, that you will uphold it. Not 40% of the time, not 48% of the time, which is a high record today. We expect you to uphold the Constitution 100% of the time and return us to the kind of a government that the Founding Fathers envisioned for us. That can happen, but it can only happen with hard work. And that's why we formed our organization. As we join Freedom First Society, and we'd invite all of you to join with us, it's not just for your own edification. It's so that as you become informed, you'll inform your neighbors, your friends, your relatives, and have to understand that they're not all going to agree. That's not going to happen. You've got to find those patriots that have that little spark of patriotism in their heart. We don't need all of your neighbors and friends. We just need 800 to 1,000 in a congressional district. Does that make sense? When, just a few weeks ago, one of my second to the youngest son graduated from medical school. We all went back east, and after his graduation, we took a group of us and we walked the Freedom Trail in Boston. You ever done that? Walk the Freedom Trail where Paul Revere rode, past the North Church. Remember this poem, One If by Land? Remember that? The point is, when Paul Revere got on his horse and rode, did everybody, and he said the British were coming, did everybody get out of their bed and help him? No. By far the majority of the people stayed in bed and turned over and said, I don't want to deal with this. I just bought a new bakery. What happens if these guys lose and King George wins? I don't want to lose my business or whatever. No, it was just a handful that got out of bed. It was a handful that stood at the bridge at Concord that fired the shot heard round the world. It was a handful that were willing to sacrifice with George Washington at Valley Forge. It was a handful. The majority of the people didn't do anything, and the majority of the people won't do anything today. We don't need the majority of the people, but we do need you. And we need your friends, because you're the only one that can go to those friends. And when we do that in enough cities around this congressional district, we'll have 1,000 members, just like they're getting close to in Idaho. And when we do that in 218 congressional districts, you'll see marked change. Now, these guys have gotten where they are in over 200 years of a plan, going back to the Illuminati, and orchestrated today by the Council on Foreign Relations. They can be stopped if we go back to our Constitution and back to the basic principles of the Founding Fathers. We have to embrace them. We have to have their kind of courage. Now, if there's a better plan, then let's do it. If somebody has got a better idea, let's do it. And certainly we're all going to go out and vote, and we're going to vote for the best candidates we can. But we can't expect a change that we really want unless we create that informed electorate. And unless we get people in office, the executive branch, in the Senate and in the House and Congress, then we can see change. We can get our country back. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for what you're doing to preserve freedom. We hope that you'd consider joining with us. Greg has literature and applications for membership and so forth over that table. Please go look at the literature. Please become informed, and please consider joining with us in Freedom First Society. Thank you.